Hey everybody, this is Nate Ruvin coming to you from my studio in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and I'm back with another Beach Boy video. I have a feeling that the topic of today's video might be, again, a little controversial, but I'm excited to hear your thoughts. The subject of the video is an idea that's been rolling through my head for a long time, but the inspiration to make the video came from a gift I was recently given. So my friend, the amazingly talented and energetic Nelson Bragg, who played with both Brian Wilson and the Beach Boys for a short time, recently sent me a really cool item. This is Jan and Dean's Vegetables single from 1972, which was a collaboration between Dean and Brian Wilson. This single was released to promote Jan and Dean's anthology album, which came out the previous year. So the fact that this single exists inspired a thought in my mind a long time ago, and I've been developing my reasoning for it over time. And I think now that I received that Vegetables 45, it's the perfect time for me to talk about this idea I've always had. So let's get into it. Could Jan and Dean have helped Brian Wilson and the Beach Boys finish Smile in the mid-60s? What you may be thinking, I know many viewers of this video just rolled their eyes at me completely. A lot of hardcore Beach Boys fans think of Jan and Dean as mid-tier impersonators of the Beach Boys at best. But the truth is, Jan and Dean were already household names while the Beach Boys were still in school. Their career preceded the Beach Boys by quite a few years. They had their own hits and their own sound before they began collaborating with the Beach Boys. Yes, the Beach Boys' sound greatly influenced Jan and Dean's sound, and yes, Brian Wilson is all over many of their biggest hits, yet Jan and Dean were a popular, established group in their own right without the Beach Boys. So we can already cast aside that impression that Jan and Dean were just Beach Boy impersonators or knockoff Beach Boys, because the truth was, the Beach Boys were just as inspired by Jan and Dean as Jan and Dean were by the Beach Boys. They both sang on each other's songs, they wrote together, they played concerts together, they were very good friends. So with that established, let's get into some of my thoughts on why Jan and Dean may have been able to help the Beach Boys finish Smile. First of all, before I get into these details, we obviously have to acknowledge that the story of Smile is intrinsically linked to the story of the Beach Boys' mental health and of the band's struggles. So this video is not meant to lessen the seriousness of those issues and of the things that Brian Wilson went through. It's just a fan hypothesis, just a fun theory to think about in my head. Let me just add that the theory I present in this video works under the assumption that Jan didn't have his car accident in April of '66 and that his life continued on as it had been normally. So, let's get into the reasons why I think Jan and Dean were apt to help the Beach Boys finish Smile. Jan Berry, at this point, had nearly a decade of production and arranging experience. What makes the Smile album so unique is its sophisticated arrangements and its experiments with studio production. Those are two things that Jan was an expert in. He had taken arrangement classes at UCLA and therefore arranged all of the Jan and Dean records, including a symphonic album they did with surf songs rearranged for a full symphony orchestra. So not only could Jan arrange harmonies, but he could arrange strings, he could arrange brass, he could arrange concert percussion. Jan was an expert in arrangement. Jan's expertise in arrangement could have helped Brian Wilson more articulately express his ideas and musical thoughts. And that's something that happened in the past. Brian Wilson and Bob Norberg conceived of the string melody for the song Surfer Moon from the Surfer Girl album, but Jan Berry was the one who put the pen to paper and arranged the notes for the musicians to read. Jan also had many years of experience with studio production. Jan began his studio career in his garage, making 2-track recordings on tape. Jan would splice and edit together different takes and different sections. He would overdub, he would add echo, and he was doing all of this from his garage when he was still in high school. So by the middle 60s, Jan had plenty of experience in studio production and arranging, and he definitely could have lent help to Brian Wilson as a co-producer. Another reason I think that Jan and Dean could have been useful in the completion of Smile was their appreciation and inclusion of humor in their work. Jan and Dean almost always had at least one or two comedy songs on each of their albums, and by this point had even produced 2 comedy albums, including Batman and Filet of Soul. Brian Wilson recorded a lot of comedy sketches, a lot of just the topics of the album are humorous, and the humor is a big part of Smile. Merging the laughter and the spoken word and the music. That's stuff that Jan and Dean had already done with Filet of Soul and Batman. Jan and Dean were quite familiar with the territory of combining music and humor. Finally, I think the reason that Jan and Dean may have helped finish Smile, because of the music they made at the time, like Save for a Rainy Day and Carnival of Sound are any indication, I think they would have been very willing to go in the psychedelic experimental direction that Brian Wilson was headed. Songs they made like I Know My Mind, Love and Hate, Summer Rain, Yellow Balloon are all very far removed from the surf and hot rod material that, let's say, some of the Beach Boys may have been more inclined to continue with. By the mid to late 60s, like Brian Wilson, Jan and Dean were also ready to expand their subject matter and experiment with more dense and layered production. Brian definitely could have benefited from having more people in his circle rooting for him and not working against him during this time. With that said, I don't believe the myth that Mike Love or any of the other Beach Boys were adamantly against Smile, or that they didn't work hard on those sessions. All of the Beach Boys, including Mike and Bruce and some of the guys that might get a little hate regarding the Smile sessions, all gave their 100% effort to making this music. With that said, I think some members of the band may have had some reservations. Bruce Johnston was notably absent from some of the band's sessions and shows during these years for saying things got a little weird. But during this time, Dean was a great friend to Brian Wilson and was involved with trying to keep Brian Wilson healthy and happy. I've heard Dean tell stories of getting Brian Wilson to come play basketball with him so they could keep him active. So while Jan may have been a better support in the studio with the arranging and the production, Dean may have just been a great supporter as a friend. And God knows there were a lot of people leeching onto Brian during that time and influencing him negatively. So to have some genuine friends around that knew him before he was the genius whiz kid would have probably helped Brian keep his head on his shoulders during that time. So, you know, in my head, these are the reasons why in an alternate universe where Jan hadn't gotten into his accident and their labels somehow gave them permission to work together, that's why I think it's a possibility that Jan and Dean could have helped finish Smile. So I'd love to hear your take. I know this story is very complicated and people take this music and these guys very seriously. So I'm very curious to hear your thoughts. I've been discovering through making these videos that there does seem to be a community out there that's quite large that actually do take Jan and Dean seriously as artists and as innovators. And so I always wonder how things could have gone if Jan maybe hadn't gotten into that accident, or if the rock and roll community at large hadn't simply almost disregarded them as the clown princes of rock and roll. So once again, this has been Nate Ruvin, coming to you with another music history video. This one was really interesting. These are just, some thoughts that have been roaming around in my head for a while, and I was really excited to hear your guys' thoughts. So thank you. Have a good one.